Well, my respect for pilots is greater than it's ever been because I know a great deal more about what can go wrong. And the professional training and professional judgment that they have to have. And how ever wondrous the technology of present-day aviation, the jets and all of that, it still comes down to human ability to fly the plane. The Wrights didn't just invent the airplane, which they aren't commonly known to have done, but what most people don't also realize, they also invented how to fly the airplane. They were the first test pilots ever. And the same is true with any pilot today. They have to learn how to do that, and it's not easy, either physically or mentally. When all the flights in the air were ordered to go aground on 9/11, to my knowledge, there was not one accident, not one mishap. They all obeyed orders, and they did so skillfully and without incident or accident. Think of the training and ability and steadfastness in the face of adversity that represents. I never had heard how low the starting salaries in fact are, and I was not only surprised, it made me angry. How can they do that? And so much is put in the hands of these people that we just take for granted. We're climbing on board those airplanes, and they are responsible for our lives. And they should be compensated, compensated not just adequately, but then some. It will decrease the ability of the people who have to apply or aspire to that career. No question. No question about it. And that would be a very big mistake and a dangerous trend. Well, clearly they have the joy of flight. The excitement, the gratification of taking off into the sky, which, as mechanized and as devoid of direct human physical contact with the air rushing by and the smell of the air up above and so forth, still is pure magic. And all of us who sit in our comfortable seat in an airliner coming into land, let's say over Washington, D.C., to look down and see all of these symbolic buildings right there before us like a chessboard is a rare privilege. When you think back in the time of George Washington, for whom the city is named, he never got to see that, but we do, and we should never, ever take it for granted. It's adding to the thrill of life, the joy of life, aviation is. And while too often we're in too great a hurry to stop and think about it, we should. And our curiosity ought to make us want to know more about who did this. Who were those guys? How'd they do it? That's the way I felt. That's how I got going on this particular book. Very little. I think the problem today is that we all take aviation for granted. It's like water coming out of the faucet in our sink. We take pure water for granted. And yet, in much of the world, that is something very rare, hard to find, pure water. And here we are, able to go where we go and do so in not only comfort, but in safety of a kind that would never have been imaginable 25, 30 years ago. And I think that the indifference to the history of aviation is in some ways symbolic of indifference to much of history today. And that's a real concern to me, and should be for all of us, because we're suffering a variation of amnesia, and it's not a healthy thing. We need to know who we are and why we are the way we are, and what these great achievements that we take for granted have cost in effort and dedication and failure, and that progress doesn't just happen. And when it happens, we should never be without that sense of good fortune for us. The advent of the airplane changed the world, changed history, changed our outlook of what's possible. How often they faced a problem, intellectual problem, that not only challenged their mental ingenuity or heft, but that put a strain on their time, patience, perseverance of a kind that very few people would have been able to face. They would have given up. They weren't just physically daring, they were intellectually daring. This isn't just a physical adventure into the blue, it's an intellectual adventure into the blue. The idea that these two young men from Ohio, who never graduated from high school, let alone college, and who had had no technical training whatever, would not only accomplish what they did intellectually, but then proceed to accomplish what they did physically, and against the very real likelihood that they could be killed on any one of their test flights, is itself a story of inspiration. I would have wanted to have written the book I've written about the Wright brothers, even if they had not succeeded, because so admirable are their human traits. So much is there to learn from their conduct and from their accomplishments that that in itself is, to me, sufficient reason to give them a just place in our story as a people, as a country. History isn't just about politics and the military, though it's often taught that way. There's much else that is done by people of great ability or great courage or great good luck that figures dramatically in how we live, what we count as important, and how we hope to continue to behave as citizens. And they're a prime example. Well, I think she's been left on the sidelines too long. She's used a theatrical image. She deserves to be brought front and center, and in the light, and credit that she deserves is long overdue. She was not only devoted to them and always there when they needed her, but she was one to prod them into keeping going, to encourage them, to keep them on track, to be a little bit critical and as she said, wrathy with them at times. And she was funny, and she was more sociable than they. She was much better at addressing the press than they were. They didn't like it. They weren't very good at it. She liked it, and she was very good at it. And I think it's reasonable to say that if it had not been for her, if she hadn't existed, the story might well not have come out as it did. And it's the same is true for their father. Their mother died too early along when they were still teenagers. But the father's influence on their ethical and principle background, their notion of right and wrong, their ideas of behavior, of loyalty, of honesty, were all achieved at home largely because of him. And their love of books, their love of reading, their ability to use the English language, all derived from him. One of my favorite quotes of all is from Wilbur, where he says, when he was asked, what's the secret to success? He said, pick out a good mother and father and grow up in Ohio. And that's largely true as an analysis of why they turned out the way they did. Well, one of the problems, of course, is we don't see the planes from the ground as one used to see them, in focus, relatively nearby. And when flying in one of those early planes, you were looking down at a landscape. You were very often navigating by the landscape, by the flow of the river, the way that particular highway went through the countryside. I think that there are still thrilling visual phenomena to enjoy, that a late afternoon light when the vapor trail is flowing from behind an airplane sailing out over the Atlantic Ocean heading for Europe. That's a pretty thrilling thing to see, and particularly when there's 4 or 5 of those trails being caught by the late sunlight and it turned pure gold. It's really thrilling. And you think, imagine what people in other days would have thought if they'd seen that. They would think it's a miracle. And of course, it is a miracle, but it's a man-made miracle, a miracle created with the human mind and human bravery, courage. Yes, the old DC-3 that you had to walk uphill just to get your seat. I love those planes.